Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this ED Talk, a new paradigm for the future of education. I'm going to present our speaker, Michael Fung, is Executive Director of the Institute for the Future of Education at Tecnológico de Monterrey, leading efforts to generate, transfer, and disseminate applicable knowledge about educational innovations and seeking disruptive global solutions for the future of higher education and lifelong learning. Michael Fung was formerly Deputy Chief Executive at Skills Future Singapore, where he led the development of a comprehensive education and training ecosystem under the National Skills Future movement, which has become a global reference for workforce skills development and lifelong learning. He was founding president of the Higher Education Planning in Asia Association and serves on several global boards and committees. Michael, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hola, buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Very happy to see all of you here. I know it's after lunch, it's a difficult time. And I want to spend about 15 minutes or so speaking with you about a new paradigm for the future of education. If we look at the future of work, there are many disruptions that we are faced with. And here we can take the perspective of an employer as a company, or we can think about ourselves as individuals, as professionals, as workers, or even students that are about to come out to the labor market. One of the biggest disruptions we've seen, for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years is the advancement of technology and the pace of technology disrupting the future of work, disrupting job tasks. That has just accelerated so much over the last few years. In almost every industry, we're talking about digitalization, we're talking about automation, we're talking about the use of data to better serve our customers and to reduce costs. So that's one big disruption. There's also a disruption with shifting demographics. In many advanced economies, the population is getting older, and with advancements in medical science, people are living longer. And that means that we need to remain employable for longer periods of our lives. We might change 5 to 6 careers throughout our lives as a result. So the old paradigm where you get your qualifications or you get your professional skills, if you're in the crafts, even the trades profession, you get your skills, and you hope that that will last you for the rest of your life. And that assumption has changed dramatically. With shifts in globalization and localization due to geopolitical movements, we're also seeing shifts in the kinds of skills that's needed for different economies. And finally, the COVID pandemic, that has really accelerated all these changes. In the last 2 years, we all had to adjust to working remotely. Businesses have to find new ways of serving customers. They are not able to see them face to face. And we have to deal with volatility in supply chains, in the ability to communicate. So that has really disrupted the way work looks like. And now we're talking about hybrid mode of working. It's a new normal, if you would, but there will be further disruptions in the future of work. Now, this is a report that was produced by Skills Future last year, looking at some of the new economies, new growth areas in the economy. And 3 big areas were identified: digital economy, the green economy, and the care economy. As I have already discussed, the role of technology and digitalization is extensive across all industry sectors. And you could see in the chart the number of jobs and the kinds of skills that is being impacted as we look at the future of the digital economy. At the same time, there's a rise in the skills that are needed for the green economy. We're talking about sustainability across all kinds of industrial sectors, and the kinds of knowledge and skills on how to manage those processes, how to make our businesses more sustainable. There's a growth in the kinds of skills that's needed in that space. And finally, with shifting demographics, with aging population, there's a growing need for the care economy. So skills associated with that growth. I just want to give you a snippet of snapshot of these skills as an illustration that as we think about the future of economies, we have to think about new areas that are coming up and how do we prepare our workforce for these new areas. So what is clear is as we look at the future of work, as we look at disruptions, the traditional model of education is no longer fit for purpose. It takes way too long for the education system to deliver the necessary skills for the graduates, but by the time they graduate, that first qualification is not going to be able to last them throughout their lives in terms of employability. We need a new paradigm of education that moves us from a front-loaded model to one that is much more lifelong learning. So think about the education system not as a formal system for the first 12 or 16 years of your life, but one that you can keep coming back into the system as and when you need new skills, new competencies, new capabilities. And in case there are people in the audience who are thinking, it's education not just about skills. When I use the word skills, I'm talking more broadly, not just technical skills, but also soft skills. That is very important when you think about the resilience of the workforce. So we need to move from a front-loaded model to a lifelong model. We also need to create multiple pathways in our education system. In many countries today, our education systems are still fairly limited. The number of pathways that's catering to people of different backgrounds, of different attainment levels. So you can imagine a person that may have gone through initial years of formal education and then decided to come out and pursue a professional career and became very skilled at what they're doing. Maybe a number of years later, they would like to come back into the educational system and be able to advance, whether academically or in their skills, and be able to get to the next level. Does our current education system cater for that? Does it cater for that at scale across multiple population segments? I think the answer is no. For most countries, our educational systems are still fairly limited. So we need a system that has multiple pathways. One big question that's facing higher education in the last few years, especially during the COVID pandemic, is what's the value of that education? What's the relevance of the competencies and skills acquired in that educational journey that is relevant to the work that graduates go on into? And there's a growing gap between what employers require and what graduates are coming out of school with the skill sets that they have. So we need to integrate work and study elements in a much more extensive manner within the curriculum. And somewhere in that new paradigm of education, we need to make sure that we're updating it with new skills, priority skills, emerging skills that is of relevance to industry and to the employment market. And to find ways to provide advisory to individuals so that they're able to understand, based on the aspirations that they have, what kind of skills-based progression pathways they can undertake. Now, to build a system like that, to make the new paradigm of education a reality, we can't do this as an institution, we can't do this as an individual entity. We need to mobilize an entire ecosystem for it to work. I'll draw from my experience in building the Skills Future system in Singapore. At the center of it is a strong government push to reform the education system to a lifelong model. It doesn't have to be the government at the center. It could be some other actor. But in the Singapore case, the government made a strong push. But government's action is not sufficient. Government action alone is not sufficient. We needed the industry to be behind it. We needed enterprises to embrace a skills-based hiring model and to be able to support the workforce on the lifelong learning journey, we needed to work with the trade associations, especially the professional bodies, to incorporate the kinds of professional certifications and competencies into a broader skills-based continuing education and training system. We also needed to work with the unions because they have the interests of their workers at heart, and we have to make sure that the policies and initiatives that we were delivering had the support of the unions, who would then support their workers to undertake lifelong learning. Training providers is another big group. There has traditionally been a strong group of private training providers in this space, but in the recent years, the institutes of higher learning, so these are the polytechnics, the institute, the universities, and the technical vocational education institutes, have all come into this ecosystem. So let me switch gears a little bit. I've described the imperative for a new paradigm for the future education. So I currently lead an institute at TEC Monterrey, the Institute for the Future Education. And our dream and our goal is to distill our understanding of what the future education needs to look like and be able to use research, education, and engagement to bring about this future education with the partnership of institutions, policymakers, supporting industries, and to get the knowledge out there to the rest of the community. So we want to be able to create a future education that will impact the lives of millions of people around the world. And we believe that there are 4 key themes around the future education. We need a future education that is fit for purpose, accessible, inclusive, and relevant. It forms a nice acronym, FAIR. As future education needs to be fair. Fit for purpose, we need to ensure that the pedagogical methods and the use of technology continues to be effective in delivering learning outcomes, not just to traditional students, but also to a much wider segment of non-traditional learners, the workforce, the professionals, members of the society. We need to ensure that we are able to effectively deliver learning to all those segments. Future education needs to be accessible. The traditional model is students come into a classroom at fixed times, follow a fixed curriculum, and that's not very convenient for working professionals, for young parents, mothers, that are working at home. Those kinds of learning models are not accessible. So we need to make sure that future education is much more accessible to fit the context and the needs of different people. The future education needs to be inclusive. Inclusion has been a big problem in education around the world. And how can we make the best use of technology, reduce the cost of delivery of quality education, and be able to provide more opportunities to all segments of population? And we need to work towards a concept of universal access for lifelong learning. And this is something that I believe would require strong support from policymakers around the world for that to happen as well. And finally, we need to ensure that the future education is relevant and responsive to the changes that industry is facing, that we're seeing the evolving needs of skills, different skills for industries and societies. At the Institute, we've defined 5 grand challenges that we're going to work on, and we're going to start on these grand challenges. And we invite like-minded institutions, individuals, to collaborate with us on these grand challenges. On the right side, the grand challenge of how do we elevate learning outcomes by transforming teaching and learning to ensure that it's engaging and motivating. And we have to address this not just at the higher education level, but also at the lifelong learning level. How do we understand the motivations of workers, professionals from different trades, from different industries, to ensure we deliver engaging and motivating learning design for these learners. One big area that we have moved into at TEC Monterrey is to pursue a competency-based education. one of the challenges of skills-based, competency-based education is you need to define what are the competencies and learning outcomes that you're trying to accomplish. And so we need to get better at understanding what does it take to deliver effective competency-based education and to assess competencies to be able to design these systems and elevate the learning outcomes. We also need to develop systems that would support skills development for worker job mobility and to support companies as they transform their businesses in the age of technology, in the age of disruption. And to find ways to scale up quality higher education and lifelong learning opportunities for all segments of the population. And we have to make that happen not just in a single country, but how do we do that at a global scale? And finally, it's to ensure that we can find ways to make education affordable and convenient to cater to different learner segments. So let me just sum up here. In the last 10 or 15 minutes, I've talked about the increasing frequency and impact of disruptions that's facing the future of work, that's facing companies and facing us as workers in the workforce. It is clear that we need to think about transformation of businesses, of our skills. Even for the education sector, we need to think about transformation, but we need the right capabilities to do that. If I'm a company moving from traditional manufacturing techniques to advanced manufacturing techniques, I want to make the transformation. I need to have the right skills for my employees. A combination of technical skills and soft skills is extremely important to ensure that the workforce has the adaptability, the resilience, and confidence to be able to face and overcome disruptions. I've also discussed the need for a new paradigm of education and training, one that's lifelong in nature, one that's much more flexible and adaptive to different changes, one that is accessible to different segments of the population, different segments of the workforce. And our education and training systems need to respond to this new paradigm to cater to new learner segments and build new capabilities to deliver learning to these new segments. And I welcome all of us to work together to crack the code of what the future education should look like and be able to impact the lives of millions of people with a paradigm that's much more suited in a world that is volatile, uncertain, and full of disruptions. Here are some resources. If you get access to the slides, you can access these resources for some further discussions around the topics I've just mentioned. And if you're interested, please follow our work at ife.tech.mx. Thank you. We have some time for questions, I think about 15 minutes or so for questions, or if you have a view, then we can discuss. Please.
Thank you very much for the inspiring talk. I found everything very interesting, but for me there's like an elephant in the room that wasn't mentioned. We all came here today and we were outside at one point and we all realized how hot it was. So we are currently in the biggest heat wave the country have ever seen of the past 20 years. People just, like hundreds of people just die in India and Pakistan. I'm not going to continue, but the list is very long, and I hope you see what I'm coming to. Climate change. You didn't mention that word once, and we just had the International Panel on Climate Change releasing a new report where the IPCC is gathering all the best scientists in the world, and they do this very methodological assessment of what is happening, and their conclusions are terrible each and every time. So my question is how the future of education cannot talk about that and mention the fact that we need to first mitigate. So basically everyone who is getting any form of education needs to be thinking of how can we reduce our carbon footprint to fall into the Paris Agreement and under the 2 degrees, and how can we adapt? Because climate change is already a reality for most of people.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. Given the amount of time I had, I didn't go into more details, but you do recall that I had the screen where I talked about the skills, the green skills. So so one big part of addressing climate change is to make sure that in our education and skills development systems, that we embed the concepts of sustainability and how to be responsible in how we conduct our businesses, how we conduct our processes. And we need that knowledge, that awareness to be across our workforce. It's not just the CEO, it's not just a few activists, it's actually everybody needs to have that knowledge. Now, the young people that are coming out from school today, coming out from our colleges, coming out from our high schools, they are a lot more conscious about these issues because they are exposed. But there is a whole segment of our workforce that may not have had the benefits of having that awareness. So again, it still goes back to a lifelong learning model. In every one of these kinds of training, like as I mentioned, it's not just technical skills to do a job. We need to also infuse global perspectives, sustainability perspectives, and all these important perspectives that will help individual workers to make the best decisions as they move forward. So I didn't elaborate on that, but when we looked at in the skills frameworks that we developed in the Singapore continuing education and training system, we embed all these within the specific job-related training so that we can infuse these concepts and knowledge to the wider workforce. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask, what do your biggest critics say to your proposing this new paradigm?
Well, I don't know. You can be my biggest critic. Maybe you should ask me that question. But one area that I would say that we have to be very mindful of, there is a big divide between those who have access to education and those who don't have access to education. So when we look at some of these areas of lifelong learning that we're talking about, we have to be very clear which segments of the population we're talking about, right? Because on one end of it, these are literate populations. We're giving them lifelong learning opportunities, and they have access, be it infrastructure access, or they are able to afford, to continue to learn for life. But at the very basic level, we're still struggling with providing basic education, basic infrastructure to a number of communities around the world. And that's a different, it's a different context, but it's also something that we should address as part of the future education. And I talk about the inclusion theme. There, we're looking at really how to make the best use of technology and deliver meaningful education to different communities around the world. My colleague there, Sabrina, she runs a program that we have called T-Prize, where every year it's open call for proposals. We invite proposals from startups around the Latin American region to look at how they can deliver quality learning to disadvantaged communities at a cost that they can afford. And so not sophisticated AR, VR solutions, but something that is practical, that can be scaled to those communities. And we had awarded, I think, 10 startups in the last couple of years, and some of them were helping students who were unable to attend school due to COVID. How do they continue to access learning and to be able to make a use of technology, but also processes, different processes to deliver learning to these disadvantaged communities. So I think if we think about, to your question, I think we need to think about it at several levels, and not to think about one solution that fits all segments of population. It's a very different solution design, I believe. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes, gentlemen.
Hi. I would like to ask you about the relationship of the institute you lead and the rest of the university, and how hard or easy it's been to move this change or move this agenda forward? Because I feel like it's kind of commonplace, all these aspects of lifelong learning, etc. But it's not a reality yet, like, because of academic bureaucracies. So how has been your experience been? Because it sounds like it's an institute within the university that talks about future, but how are you managing change, or how is that agenda being? Yeah.
That's a great question. Let me clarify that Institute's focus is global in nature. It's not just about serving TEC Monterrey and trying to transform TEC Monterrey. I think TEC Monterrey has already undertaken a transformation journey and is still going on that journey, and will support that, but you're really looking at the broader system. So your question is a very relevant one. Universities are some of the hardest institutions to move because of the way it's set up. In many leading institutions, if there's, if you use a word, leading institutions, they are fairly autonomous. Faculty is given a lot of space to do what they think is the right thing to do for their disciplines, and consequently, it is extremely difficult to move everybody in a specific direction. The term that I hear is, say, getting faculty to do something, it's like herding cats. It's almost impossible. But having said that, I think there is growing awareness and acceptance that universities need to do more. We cannot stay in that elite space. I think universities should embrace a much broader vision of what they can contribute back to society. Now, and if society requires a much more responsive and lifelong learning system, universities being a big recipient of public funds and having that privileged position they have in the education market should respond and should do their part. So influencing institutions to think likewise and to act likewise, I think it's a big part of what we're trying to do. I'll give an example of a project that we're working on currently. There's a project that we had put up for Erasmus funding, working with 14 institutions across Latin America to study the best practices in how institutions, how universities set up lifelong learning systems. And there's a learning journey. If you take an existing faculty and you tell them, I want you to launch a whole bunch of courses that is relevant to industry, the likelihood is that it's not going to succeed. They're going to take their old mindsets and they're going to deliver courses, and the industry is not going to find it relevant. The way it's taught is not relevant. Perhaps the content is also not directly relevant to what they need. So there's a learning journey. As institutions go through this process, they learn. We are trying to distill the best practices and to work that into a guide and be able to disseminate that more widely. And there are many conversations I've had recently about around institutions wanting to do something, but asking what should they do? How should they approach this? In the Singapore journey, which I will refer to, it took us about maybe 3 years to get our universities to truly embrace and deliver credible offerings. The first year was, okay, we'll do it because you told us to do it, but we're not going to do much. We're just going to try to work around the edges. And the second year is, okay, we want to do more, but we're still using the traditional model. And I'll say that, broadly in the third year, they realized that they needed new governance structures, new ways of designing and delivering lifelong learning courses. And they needed faculty to have new capabilities as well. So a much more responsive, agile model, drawing on industry practitioners, bringing them into the classrooms and delivering short modular programs to a range of audience coming from the industry. So we're trying to do this through, that's one of the mechanisms that we are using to influence institutions through researching and disseminating best practices.
Thank you.
We can probably take one more question. Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for your speech. I'd like to ask you a question. You mentioned several times the integration between technical skills and other kind of skills, soft skills, transversal skills, etc. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the when, where, and how this integration takes place?
Okay. Thanks. Also, I think that's a very good question as well. Let me maybe discuss a little bit about why each of those types of skills are important. Right? Technical skills clearly is important to be able to perform a particular job task. So for example, if employers are looking for employees that have knowledge about digital marketing, for example, search engine optimization, branding your products using social media and so on, they would want the employees to have those technical skills, to actually know how to launch online marketing campaigns, for example. So those skills are very important, because if you had a general marketing degree and you go to employers today and they say, can you do this for me? And you're like, no, I don't have the skill. So there are two choices. One is the employer says, sorry, I'm not going to take you for the job. Or two, I'll take you in and I'll train you. But given the faster and faster business cycles, employees are becoming more and more impatient. They really want students with work-ready skills. So that's the technical skill. You need that skill for that particular job, otherwise you're not able to do it. Another good example is computer programming or coding or working with data. If you don't have that skill, it's hard for an employer to take you on for that skill. Now, but that skill alone, these technical skills alone, doesn't give the right balance, right, in terms of how a person thinks, how a person works in a team, how a person communicates. So when we talk about soft skills, some of the soft skills that have been consistently rated as important by employers would include things like leadership, communication, critical thinking, being able to embrace change, global perspectives. Now these are soft skills. You don't usually go to a course and say, okay, I'm going to develop creative thinking or critical thinking in one course. But you design your training program so that it nurtures the development of these skills. But it's to keep in mind that every time that we deliver technical skills training, we also need to embed some of these soft skills training within that overall curriculum design. Otherwise, you have individuals that are very skilled in the area, but they may not be very adaptable to changes that's going to come. So if you take a look at the skills frameworks documents that's online, it's open access, you would see that for every job role, there is technical skills defined and also the soft skills that are defined that is required for that role. And in the training design, it's integrated. It's delivered together rather than sort of as a separate course, because many of soft skills have to be acquired through experience, through project-based learning and so on. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time. Thank you very much for your attending the session, and thank you for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.